Hello, my name is David Higgins and I'm a lecturer in English literature at the University of Leeds. I'm a specialist in literature of the Romantic period, and one of the most significant writers of that period is the poet and artist William Blake. Blake is a difficult author who had very unconventional views for his time and, over the course of his career, developed a complex private mythology. This can make some of his work difficult to understand, although Songs of Innocence and of Experience is more accessible than most of his illustrated books. The aim of this podcast is to help you to understand what Blake's trying to do in this work by placing it in the context of attitudes to childhood in the late 18th century. And it's an example of some of the things we do at university level, where we're really often very concerned with placing texts within the historical context and thinking about how they reflect debates of a particular period. Let's start with the title page. You'll see that the full title is Songs of Innocence and of Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. And I really want to emphasise the significance of songs and contrary states, and I'll go on to talk about both of those aspects of this text. There's also the image, of course, which is crucial. There are these two cowering human figures, and then what seem to be flames above them. And critics tend to see these two figures as representing Adam and Eve, being expelled from the Garden of Eden for disobeying God. Blake is obsessed with the notion of a fall from paradise. Humanity have lost access to a paradise that he associates very much with childhood. Now, Blake's understanding of the fall is very different from that in Christian thought. So as I was saying, Christian theology understands the fall of man as the result of Adam and Eve's disobedience of God's injunction not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Blake sees the fall very differently. He sees it as having been caused by human beings, and particularly by human desire to construct institutions that restrain and constrain people's desires and people's freedom. And this notion of freedom and the way in which freedom may be restricted is something that he explores in this text. Why songs? The sorts of meters, that is the rhythm of these texts that Blake uses, are ones associated with children's verse and with popular songs like ballads and hymns. So for example, you could take a poem like The Divine Image and sing it to the tune of a Christmas carol, like While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night. While shepherds watch their flocks by night, to mercy, pity, peace and love will pray in their distress. I won't carry on, but you get the point. So even though Songs of Innocence and Experience isn't necessarily aimed at children, it's using a form that's accessible to children, and also accessible, I suppose, to people who weren't necessarily highly literate and highly educated, because it reflects songs and perhaps popular verse that they may have heard in other contexts. One of the things that Blake's doing in this text is engaging with the sorts of verse that was written for children in the period and doing something to that genre. Much 18th century children's verse was religious and didactic. And by didactic, I mean that it was designed to teach a moral lesson, meant to inculcate duty or virtue or whatever. In contrast, Blake's verse tends to refuse to draw simple morals and emphasises imaginative freedom. So he uses a lot of biblical imagery, particularly in Songs of Innocence, but he's very much opposed to conventional Christianity, and he sees Christianity as tied up with government power and government oppression, as he sees it, of the people. Now, in the 18th century, and Blake's writing right at the end of the 18th century, there's still a very strong tradition of Christian thought that sees children as rather like evil imps whose natural maliciousness needs correction. And if you've ever read Great Expectations, which is a novel we teach the first years at Leeds, Pip is very much mistreated by his sister guardian and her cronies, and they think of him as naturally vicious, i.e. naturally tending towards vice or evil. And that sort of assumption is very prevalent in the 18th century, and is something that Blake's very concerned with and concerned to argue against. Blake isn't alone in this. There are other writers and educationalists people like Locke and Rousseau, who also emphasise childish innocence and, as it were, benevolent natural tendencies if properly educated. One of the major hymn writers of the 18th century was Isaac Watts, and his divine songs attempted in an easy language for the use of children, which was first published in 1715, but was published in numerous editions throughout the 18th century. This text gives a sense of what I mean by didactic. And I should say that I'm not sort of setting up Watts here as someone to be mocked. I mean, there's something about these songs, I think, that for a modern audience is odd and uncomfortable, but he is a very fine hymn writer, and I feel I should emphasise that to be fair to him. So this is the title page to his text. You see the full title there, and then a biblical reference. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, thou hast perfected praise. And this notion of praise is really important to Watts. The idea that these songs should be, among other things, praising God and thanking God for the gift of life. His preface emphasises that the purpose of the songs is to give children a relish for virtue and religion. So they're trying to teach children lessons. And they're very clearly meant to inculcate piety and good morals and so on. And you can see this from the contents page. This isn't the complete contents, but it's the first page of them. And you get a sense of the sorts of things that Watts is interested in inculcating. So I won't read them all, but just to pick out a few. The first one, a general song of praise to God. Lower down, the excellency of the Bible. Heaven and hell, which I'll come back to. The advantages of early religion. Against lying, against quarrelling and fighting. Against idleness and mischief. Against evil company. Obedience to parents. So this is about virtue, restraint, obedience, duty. Watts imagines children singing these songs, and by singing these songs, they learn to embody the sort of rules and regulations that are inscribed within them and within the text. And there's a real emphasis here, I think, on what you shouldn't do, on resisting sin and temptation. It might remind us of a couplet from Blake's poem, The Garden of Love, from Songs of Experience. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. This notion of thou shalt not, which of course Blake has taken from the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, etc., is something he finds very problematic. He thinks of Orthodox Christianity as basically telling people what they can't do, rather than allowing people the freedom to express themselves and express their imaginations. So he's really coming at childhood, coming at human life from the opposite end of the spectrum from Watts. And the notion of writing songs that tell people what not to do is something that Blake's really not comfortable with. And we see that in Songs of Innocence and of Experience. We can think about what Blake might be doing with popular songs like Watts in a bit more detail by thinking about one of Watts's songs, Heaven and Hell. I'll just read it. And just remember, this is meant to be sung by a young child. There is beyond the sky a heaven of joy and love. And holy children, when they die, go to that world above. There is a dreadful hell and everlasting pains. There sinners must with devils dwell in darkness, fire and chains. Can such a wretch as I escape this cursed end? And may I hope, where'er I die, I shall to heaven attend. Then will I read and pray, will I have life and breath, lest I should be cut off today and sent to eternal death. This is not something I imagine that contemporary educationalists would recommend for young children, because there's a great deal of threat to this song. It's about the promise of heaven, but it's also what happens to you if you're bad, if you misbehave, if you don't follow the rules and regulations of society. You will go to hell, and you will go to eternal death. You will never get God's love. So it's quite a sort of ominous text, I think. And also the child is imagined to imagine themselves as a wretch, someone unhappy and despicable, someone born into sin. There's no sense there that the child is automatically sort of innocent and virtuous. And this is something that Blake's really arguing against, I think, in his text. I move on now to talk about a text that Blake wrote. He first published Songs of Innocence in 1789, and then published Innocence and Experience together in 1794. And among other things, in between that time, he wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was published in 1790. Blake thinks about heaven and hell in a very unorthodox way and very differently from Watts. So thinking about how Blake conceives heaven and hell can help us understand his other texts as well. So in this text, Blake inverts orthodox Christian ideas of heaven and hell. Heaven in this text becomes something negative and problematic. Hell becomes something positive and rather celebratory, I think. I have here a couple of quotations from the text to give a sense of what I'm arguing. Without contraries, says Blake, is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human experience. From these contraries spring what the religious call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active, springing from energy. It's quite an interesting take here on the idea of heaven and hell, and if you like, an interesting reading of Watts's song. If in Watts's song, heaven is what you get if you're controlled, restrained, obedient, if you stay within boundaries, and hell is the punishment you get if you step over boundaries. Blake thinks of these things somewhat differently. Evil, or hell, he argues in this text, may be actually about freedom and about human expression and human individuality. It may not be a problem. Good may be more of a problem because good is about control, restraint, and limits. But he also imagines a sort of relationship between these two things that's somehow productive and part of human life. So the idea of these contrary states that he refers to in the title page of Songs of Innocence and of Experience, these aren't necessarily completely in opposition. There might be a relationship, and a productive relationship, between these contrary states. One thing I would say, though, is that we have to be careful, I think, with any Blake text of saying, this is what Blake thought. His texts try out lots of different ideas and claims, not all of which fit together very well. We shouldn't treat any bit of them or any particular utterance as his sort of authentic view on anything. And in fact, to try and take a single view from any of his texts is to miss the point. Whatever they are, they're not meant to be didactic. They're not meant to tell you what to think, unlike Watts's songs. They're meant to, as it were, stimulate your own imagination. An example of what I mean is in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, there's a long list of what Blake calls proverbs of hell, some of which are quite difficult to understand, some of which are deliberately provocative, some of which are deliberately confusing. And sometimes these proverbs are sort of quoted out of context as if Blake said them. Well, he didn't. They're written as proverbs of hell. What the historical Blake's relationship to them was is complex and ambiguous. I've picked sort of at random 3 examples on the slide. The first and probably the most famous one is the road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Blake's not necessarily putting that as a view that we should all buy into, but he's suggesting that there might be things that one might learn by going too far, by crossing boundaries, by being excessive. The next one, better murder a sleeping infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. Probably the most provocative of all of them, I think. And again, we shouldn't necessarily see this proverb as advocating child murder, though one could see it as that. The idea is it's a provocative way of making us think about what are the negative things of not acting on desires, of repressing one's desires, even if those desires are problematic and even if those desires are harmful to others. Finally, the pride of the peacock is the glory of God. And Blake's being deliberately provocative here again. He's picking one of the 7 deadly sins in Christian theology, pride, and suggesting that there's something good, something to be celebrated about pride, just as at other points he suggests there's things to be celebrated about greed or about lust. So, for Blake, traditional Christian theology doesn't necessarily articulate in an accurate way what human experience is really like, the complexity of human experiences, and the fact that things that might be problematic, might seem sinful, can also be beneficial and liberating. And that's what Blake's really interested in, I think. So to return to the Songs of Innocence, they're not necessarily aimed at children, but they are about childhood in various forms. They reflect his knowledge and reading of 18th century children's verse, and they also reflect his unorthodox religious views. Unlike most children's verse of the time, they emphasise freedom, imagination, and are often quite critical of authority. The imagery is often pastoral, that is, it refers to a sort of notion of idyllic country life, and often has religious resonances, notions of lambs and shepherds and so on, going back to language associated with Jesus in the New Testament. And I've just picked out two Songs of Innocence to give you a sense of what I think's interesting about what Blake's doing and how it might relate to what someone like Watts is doing. The first one is the nurse's song from Songs of Innocence. When the voices of children are heard on the green, and laughing is heard on the hill, my heart is at rest within my breast, and everything else is still. Then come home, my children, the sun is gone down, and the dews of night arise. Come, come, leave off play, and let us away, till the morning appears in the skies. No, no, let us play, for it is yet day, and we cannot go to sleep. Besides, in the sky the little birds fly, and the hills are all covered with sheep. Well, well, go and play till the light fades away, and then go home to bed. The little ones leaped and shouted and laughed, and all the hills echoed. This is, if you like, the opposite to Watts' songs, because it's about a dialogue between adults and children. The nurse wants the children to come home. It's the end of the day. The time for play is over. The children don't want to do that. They want to carry on, as children will. They're not accepting the boundaries set by the adult, by the nurse. But obviously what's crucial here is the nurse responds to them. The nurse doesn't then lay down the law. The nurse actually says, okay then, you can play for longer. Now that may seem like quite a sort of trivial thing, but it's actually really important because it suggests a very different sort of relationship between adult and child from the relationship imagined by Watts, which is all about the adult world telling children what the boundaries are and exactly how they should behave. This is much more of a dialogue, if you like. And there's a real sense, I think, of freedom and joy, and you see that in the image accompanying the poem. So, I mean, one could try and find sort of dark, sinister overtones in this poem, perhaps the idea of the dews of night arising and so on. But I think, of all the poems in Innocence, this is one of the most purely innocent. But as you're probably aware, some of the other poems in Innocence are more complex and more troubled, and more inflected by darkness. And of course, the analogue of the nurse's song in Experience, there's another poem in Experience called the nurse's song, is itself much, much darker than this one, and much more about bitterness, and much more about a sort of alienation between adults and children. But I'm going to pick now the Chimney Sweeper from Innocence. And again, there's a darker, more sinister version of the Chimney Sweeper in Experience. But even the one in Innocence, I think, is rather troubled and problematic. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, or yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved, so I said, Hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was asleeping, he had such a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing they run, and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark, and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. This is, I think, a more complex poem than the Nurse's Song. There's a social context to this. There are a lot of chimney sweeps in London at the end of the 18th century. It was very dangerous labour. It caused very bad physical ailments to the small children who did it, who lived in conditions of terrible poverty, and often died at a very early age. And there was quite a lot of controversy about it in the newspapers of the time, which Blake would have been well aware of. So the figure of the chimney sweep is a figure that might represent, I suppose, the poorest and most apparently insignificant of society, but also might be seen as a figure of oppression and the way in which, as it were, the rich, for Blake, might exploit the most poor and vulnerable, and particularly children. So there's that social context to it, which I think is quite important. One of the interesting things about this poem is what this poem has to say about the imagination. It emphasises this dream that Tom has of an angel. And it seems to be a dream of innocence, a dream of pastoral celebration. Down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run. But of course, it's a dream. It's a dream that makes him feel better about his lot, that makes him more accepting of his life and accepting of his lowly status, accepting of his suffering. That's not necessarily a good thing, I don't think, for Blake. Angels in Blake can often be rather problematic, rather similar figures. And note here that the angel is telling Tom what to think. If he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. The sort of thing that you might find in one of Isaac Watts's hymns. And I think if one positions this poem or this song in the context of the whole of Songs of Innocence and Experience, it should make us suspicious of this notion of moralising, of telling children what they should how they should behave and how they should think about God. And basically that they should sort of, carry on, stop moaning, and then things will be okay. That one could read this poem as about ideology, as about the way in which religion in this case, or other forms of social control, might try and find ways of controlling people by offering them some sort of better life, but a long way in the future, a life after death in this case. And one could see it as an example of what Marx called religion as the opiate of the masses, as a way of controlling and keeping people restrained and keeping people docile and obedient. There are other ways of reading this poem as well, but I think this is quite a viable reading of the poem. So in the case of the chimney sweeps themselves, the moral, so if all do their duty, they need not fear harm, is palpably untrue. If chimney sweeps do their duty, if they're obedient and docile and do what they're supposed to do, they will be harmed. They will suffer, they will get ill, they will die young. Perhaps this line is aimed at somebody else, perhaps it's aimed at the reader, or more broadly at social institutions. Perhaps it's asking the reader to think about what their duty might be to the poor, to the insignificant, to the unfortunate, to the children who can't stand up for themselves. So there is moralising in this text, but it's quite different from the moralising in Watts's songs. It's much more challenging, I think, and it's much less perhaps aimed at children and much more aimed at the reader. And when it is aimed at the children, i.e. when the angel talks to Tom, I think there's a sort of irony here, or at least a question mark, over the validity of that moral. And something you see, I think, very clearly in this poem is how innocence is vulnerable. It's always liable to abuse and corruption. And of course, that's an idea that Blake really develops in Songs of Experience. So to conclude, in Songs of Experience, Blake, as I say, revisits these representations of childhood from Innocence with a more jaundiced, a more cynical eye, if you like. But we shouldn't think of it as innocence good, experience bad. Going back to the quote from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, without contraries, there is no progression. So having an understanding of the corruption of innocence may be important because it means you're recognising a problem. Both these states, both innocence and experience, embody truths about human life. I also think there's a danger with Blake, much as I like him, that he can be made into a bit of a hero. And if you've read Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials books, which I think are fantastic, but Blake in that, they're very Blakean, and Blake in that is a sort of hero, I think, for his critique of Christianity. And particularly, I think, the book is quite critical of the Catholic Church and sees the Catholic Church as a form of sort of social control. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Philip Pullman, but I think there is something problematic about that. It's very easy to say, oh, isn't the church terrible, or isn't X terrible? They're controlling everyone, they're oppressing everyone. We're actually, I think if you read Blake properly, you're aware that he's not just critiquing institutions and people in very high positions of power. He's critiquing everyone. And he's going much further, I think, than a sort of straightforward sticking it to the man type attitude. If we take Blake seriously, then many of the assumptions that most of us live by need to be questioned. The rules and regulations that we all follow, often unconsciously, need to be questioned. And if we don't question them, then in some sense, I think for Blake, we're guilty. We're guilty of fitting in, and we're guilty of being involved in a system that's controlling and oppressive. And just to finish, I think the key point about Blake is that he does have a faith in human redemption, and you see this very strongly in Songs of Innocence and Experience. In the introduction to Experience, he talks of the voice of the bard and the capacity of that voice to fall and light renew. That idea of renewal or rebirth, of somehow going beyond the corruption and the fallenness of humanity to something better than that. And I think for Blake, that renewal comes ultimately from the innate good of children.